Hello. Hello to everyone out there. Thanks so much for joining this conversation on the outlook for AI governance in 2025. Couldn't be a more timely topic, and we're excited to have a top-notch panel joining us to explore it today. My name is Zachary Arnold. I'm Analytic Lead for the Emerging Technology Observatory Data Platform here at the Center for Security and Emerging Tech in rainy Washington, D.C. I'll be your moderator today, and we're looking forward to a really lively discussion with the panel. We'll aim to spend a little more than half of today's session with the panel themselves and then open it up with plenty of time left for questions from the audience. Our goal here today is to have an open and engaging dialogue. So as questions come to mind during our initial panel conversation, please begin sharing those questions and comments in the chat. We'll do our very best to cover as many of those questions as we can. And just a logistical note in the meantime that all attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, please just use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to alert us, and a CSET team member will do their best to help you out. Now, before we jump into the conversation, a brief word from our sponsors. Today's webinar also marks the official launch of AGORA. That's a new public resource on AI governance from CSET's Emerging Technology Observatory, available online today at agora.eto.tech. Agora is a living collection of AI-relevant laws, regulations, standards, and other governance documents from the US and around the world. We're aiming to provide the standard reference for folks who are interested in AI governance and want to understand what's on the books already and what might be coming soon. The searchable user interface includes plain English summaries, thematic tags, and a variety of filters to help you quickly discover and analyze key developments in the field. You can browse collections curated by Agora's editors, such as AI-related laws in the current Congress, Chinese AI law and policy, or AI-focused governments or documents from federal agencies. Or you can explore themes of interest in Agora's original thematic taxonomy, for example, pinpointing documents that address AI bias, discuss evaluation requirements for AI, or focus on AI in specific application domains like medicine or public safety. Agora is built on an open access dataset with full text and original metadata for every document in there. And we've also got extensive documentation for both the UI and the data available on ETO's website. To get started, just go to agora.eto.tech. That's live today. We'd love to hear about how folks are using the tool and what we can do to make it more helpful. So as always, feel free to contact the ETO team directly to chat using the contact information on our website, and that's at eto.tech. And with Agora as our backdrop and our reference source, let's jump into our conversation. I will start by introducing our dynamic and uncommonly stylish panel today. They'll help us explore where AI governance and regulation may be headed in 2025. I'll start with Dr. Daniel Schiff. Daniel is an assistant professor of technology policy at Purdue University's Department of Political Science, and he's the co-director of Purdue's Governance and Responsible AI Lab, also known as GRAIL, and they're a key collaborator with CSET on the Agora project. Dr. Schiff studies the formal and informal governance of AI through policy and industry, as well as AI's social and ethical implications in domains from education to finance and criminal justice. Dr. Schiff also served as the founding responsible AI lead at JP Morgan Chase and secretary of the IEEE's first industry standard for AI ethics, and his PhD is from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Our next panelist is Mina Narayanan. She's a research analyst at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Tech, lovingly known as CSET, where she leads and collaborates on a variety of research into AI governance and assessment, including recent work on AI process framework, standards development, and implementation of emerging governance tools such as NIST's AI risk management framework. Her prior experience includes work with the US Department of State, the National Institute of Nursing Research, and the Open Government Partnership, and she holds degrees from Auburn University and Carnegie Mellon. And finally, Matt Sheehan is joining us today. Matt is a fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where his research covers global tech issues with a focus on China. He's an expert on Chinese AI governance and a key reference on the topic for CSET and others in this space. His broader work covers China's AI ecosystem, the future of Chinese technology policy, and the role of tech in China's political economy. Matt is the author of the 2019 book, The Trans-Pacific Experiment: How China and California Collaborate and Compete for Our Future, as well as articles for The Atlantic, Bloomberg, Wired, and many other outlets. Matt lived and worked in China from 2010 to 2016, and he's a graduate of Stanford University. So we're really excited to have all three of you here today with me. Welcome. And I think we'll jump right into our discussion. And I want to start, we're sitting here in DC, stone's throw from the White House and from the Capitol as well. And what's on everyone's mind right now is, of course, the transition and administration. So Mina, I want to start with you. You know, Several landmark US AI governance initiatives, the AI executive order, chief among them maybe, might not persist into the next administration. Some of the priorities laid out in these initiatives might, but right now it's very uncertain from where I'm sitting what's going to hold on and what isn't. So what's your view? Which of these priorities, the priorities for AI governance in the Biden administration, do you expect to see renewed next year, and which will fall away or change significantly?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. I appreciate it. And I've also never been called uncommonly stylish before, so thank you very much. I'd expect several priorities to be renewed in the incoming administration. Among those, I think are AI safety, preventing our competitors from gaining an edge in AI, and also strengthening the domestic AI ecosystem. Trump's inner circle is concerned with AI safety, and if the incoming administration does decide to really pursue military AI applications and really accelerate AI adoption in the United States, they're going to have to think about AI safety and AI trustworthiness. The president-elect has also appointed several China hawks to his cabinet. And so I suspect kind of watching what our competitors and our adversaries are doing will continue to be a priority. Some priorities that we may not see or that may be de-emphasized in the incoming administration is sort of a really proactive focus on attracting technical talent from around the world to live and work in the United States. There may be sort of a very narrowly scoped focus on that in the incoming administration. But I wouldn't expect the same emphasis to be placed on that as the Biden administration did. I want to note too that attracting technical talent is key to maintaining US leadership in AI. And we really neglect the contributions of people outside of the United States at our own peril. I'd also expect less of an emphasis on addressing certain impacts and harms from AI that really affect the social fabric of our country. So I'm thinking of things like worker displacement and a focus on algorithmic discriminations and harms. We may see less of an emphasis on those in the next administration.
Hmm. Yeah, no, really interesting. I think the growing role of China in U.S. regulatory discussions about AI is something I definitely want to come back to in a minute. And emphasis on talent too is something that CSET's focused on quite a while. It's interesting to watch. During the campaign, President-elect Trump, on the one hand, made promises about significantly reducing barriers for highly skilled or credentialed immigrants. On the one hand, on the other hand, we see for example, personnel joining the White House and OMB right now who, were involved in some serious roadblocks to those sorts of immigrants in the last administration. I think it'll be really interesting and uncertain to me how that's going to play out. Daniel, I want to turn to you. Just any more thoughts on the transition and thinking maybe a little more broadly in time. So, the transition, I think everyone's expecting a burst of activity pretty quick. But these effects are going to unfold, over the next few years. What are you expecting, and what do you think we should be paying attention to as signs of a direction and policy, over, not just the next several weeks, but months and years to come?
Yeah, a very fair question. And it's great to be with you, Zach, for the launch of Agora and to get a chance to brainstorm with you, Mina and Matt. I think, Mina, observations make good sense to me. But I want to suggest a couple other sort of, trends or lack of trends. So one is, at the executive agency level, we are seeing realignments, we're seeing new appointments. they will shift priorities, but to your point, Zach, those priorities face inertia. So when they go through staff changes, when they go through the notice and comment process, they go through lawsuits, it takes time for those changes or lack of regulation to sort of become visible. But we'll still see some of this sort of social media or big tech skepticism show up in some major agencies. On the other hand, at the legislative level, we might not see much change, at least in terms of our sort of current status quo. So that there is, to my sort of belief, has been a strong bipartisan consensus on US innovation as a focus, on outcompeting China as a focus. I think that has come from both parties. I think it will continue to come. And I don't think we're going to see something like a European Union AI Act equivalent in the US or a federal privacy law. So no big AI bill. Maybe we'll see smaller bills like around child sexual abuse material or some very targeted contexts. But it may be a little bit more of the same at the legislative level with some of these changes kicking in over time at the executive level. And then I'll say sort of other trends that we should be thinking about over the next few years are actually coming outside of the main federal government apparatus. So things like standards, do they kick into place? Are they credible? Do they become adopted? Are there auditing and certification schema that organizations start to use? Do the lawsuits sort of come to fruition and we get rulings on copyright and fair use? And some of the appointments of judges can play into that. Some guidance from groups like the USPTO can play into that. But I think that'll be a little bit more piecemeal than just sort of the first 100 days action for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. So I want to come back to the role, what I see, at least from my perch in DC, as the growing role of sort of the international scene and China in particular as a near peer or peer competitor in AI, depending on who you ask. I mean, Matt, this is really your turf. We've seen, as the transition sort of unfolds, many of the figures, for key roles in the administration or poised, for influence from the outside, are really stressing the need for the U.S. to keep ahead of China in the AI race as they see it. There's a lot of discussion about what China is achieving in AI, how China will or will not govern the technology as people expect it, and how regulating AI in the U.S. could create opportunities for China or interfere with innovation. You've been following these discussions for a while. What do you think the dialogue in DC is getting right and wrong about how AI is unfolding in China right now?
Sure. In terms of what it's getting right, I'd say there's an increasing appreciation that China is essentially a peer competitor or a near peer competitor. I think the kind of US assessments of Chinese tech capabilities have at times swung from one extreme to the other. I think going back to 2015, 16, people would have told, China authoritarian, can't innovate, et cetera. And around 2018, 19, the beginning of the trade war, and soon after China's national AI plan launched, you saw assessments swing to totally the other side, where there was almost like a foregone conclusion that China was going to dominate the US in AI. And I think we've settled in a pretty rational place, at least the people who are following this relatively closely, which is a pretty big and influential group, that the US might have a small lead on certain aspects of AI, but when that lead is very fragile, if it exists at all, and kind of the only barrier left between the two ecosystems, if you think about data, talent, sort of a startup ecosystem, and then compute as the fundamentals of AI, the only really defensible turf that we have left is on the compute front. And I think that the DC policy consensus has kind of consolidated around that. We can't just count on cutting off the talent and then withering away. What we can try to lever is our advantage on compute and export control. So I think that's a consensus that's pretty much in the right place. I think what it's missed is just how restrictive or how heavy-handed Chinese AI regulations are to date. I think my focus is on Chinese AI regulations, and oftentimes when I sort of mention that to someone, their first reaction is I thought they didn't have any regulations on AI. I thought it was just total Wild West over there, and that's why they're ahead, because their companies can just do whatever they want and take all the data. And that is just a stereotype that's not true. China has, I would say, the world's most meaningful binding AI regulations in place that are actually like changing the behavior of AI companies today and that are imposing sort of burdens on them today. And those regulations are primarily coming out of the place of the CCP's fear about AI's impact on information. You know, what is the chatbot going to say about the CCP? What is the chatbot going to say about Xi Jinping? They go a bit wider than that, but that's sort of the root of all the regulations. And while China is currently in this kind of shift where they've shifted more towards a kind of a pro-development stance towards AI, over the past like 18 months or so, from a very restrictive, very kind of conservative early stance, the burden that is placed on the companies when it comes to compliance is still just far higher than we can sort of imagine today. Any generative AI provider has to register that model with the government. They have to do a ton of pre-deployment testing to make sure the model won't say X, Y, and Z, and the data sources are all sort of safe data sources. The models are queried almost every day by the government to make sure they're not saying anything bad. The companies are called in for regular meetings. So, you know, what lesson do we take from this? Like, on the one hand, China is pretty much at the frontier. On the other hand, they have highly burdensome regulations. You could have different takeaways from that, but I think that's the level of burden of those regulations, I think, is not appreciated.
Yeah, no, really interesting. You know, sort of continuing to fill out our sort of portrait of the different regulatory actors that are going to be active in 2025. I want to talk about states in the US, you know, and Daniel, I'll bring this to you first. You know, there's, you know, specific activity in particular, you know, niches, deepfakes or whatever in Congress. We see the same trends playing out in the states as well. And in many cases, it seems to me the states have begun moving ahead of the federal government, certainly on the legislative front in many areas of AI regulation. Do you think there are particular topics that we're likely to see movement on at the state level in 2025? Like what trends are you tracking there?
Yeah, this is another great question. And the state level, the subnational level, is where the dynamics can be really interesting when the federal level is stalled in some ways. So just sort of tracking the numbers, the last time I had looked this up, it was something like 450 bills had been proposed at the state level. And now I think it's like 700, 800, maybe more. Now only a fraction, like 10%-ish, will get enacted because the legislatures are only meeting for a couple of months a year in some cases. So they only have 1 week or 1 day to talk about AI. But we've seen sort of different clusters of topics that have popped up. A couple of years ago, it was more just sort of task forces and studies of economic impacts. Certainly stuff in places like autonomous vehicles. And in the last year, as you observe, Zach, there's been a bunch on again, child sexual abuse material with deepfakes and some political deepfakes regulation in a couple dozen states. But there's other really interesting ones that may sort of come down the pipeline. So the sort of general risk management, again, more like the EU AI Act, something like SB 1047 that the governor vetoed in California could really make waves. We get this sort of California effect. We still have growing privacy legislation. We have legislation in areas like labor, so New York, Illinois, Colorado. So maybe moving from some of our sort of older topics, including things like biometrics and facial recognition, to either a few of the big states putting forward major persuasive regulation. That would be something I'd be very interested to see. Otherwise, I'd be curious to see states put forward regulation on general risk management, on labor practices, and on sector-specific regulations, like places like healthcare.
Yeah. Mina, let me bring the same question to you, kind of, filling out our cast of characters, so to speak, for the next year and going forward. I think when we talk about AI regulators, AI regulation, most people are thinking bureaucrats in DC, maybe in the state capitol if they're feeling especially creative. It's my sense AI governance is going well beyond and in some ways not waiting for those actors, beyond those particular sort of formal governmental venues, and even into the private sector. So I'm just curious, like what are some other types of regulatory actors, civil society or elsewhere, that you think we also need to bring into this conversation as we're, looking for the next year?
Yeah, so in the United States, I'll be tracking what the Chief Digital and AI Office is doing. And so this is an office in DoD that's responsible for all things AI policy and oversight. And so over the past year, CDAO has developed a responsible AI toolkit. They launched an AI bias bounty to try and identify kind of unknown risks in large language models. And so they're really doing great work on building trustworthy and responsible AI. And over the next year, I think they're planning on kind of interviewing stakeholders and seeing how useful their toolkit actually was to kind of comply with different directives like 3000.09, which governs the development and use of semi-autonomous and autonomous weapon systems. I'll also be tracking kind of what industry players are doing, and especially how kind of industry interacts with government. And so, recently Meta made its llama models available to US government agencies and defense contractors working in the national security space. And Anthropic has made its Claude models available in similar ways too. And so it'll be really interesting to see how kind of open and closed models kind of stack up against each other, and how they kind of shape kind of the defense industrial base and how kind of the government goes about its business. Looking internationally, I'll be tracking activity from AI safety summits, and sort of outputs from those gatherings. The most recent one just happened in San Francisco. It was a convening of this sort of international network of AI safety institutes, and there are some really interesting outputs from that gathering. So countries or members committed millions of dollars to studying kind of synthetic content and its impacts on society. They also members also kind of underwent this joint testing exercise to better understand some of the methodological challenges that come up with testing AI systems in different contexts and using different languages. So that is certainly an area to watch. And looking across the Atlantic to the EU, the EU AI office is going to shoulder a lot of responsibility in the coming years, kind of working to implement the EU AI Act and developing a kind of code of practice for general purpose AI developers.
All right, so we've got quite a list going already of sort of folks to watch. We've got at the US, we've got federal, state, maybe even local. We've got US industry. We've got regulators in other countries, China arguably sort of leading the field in terms of the breadth and depth of some of the regulations they've got going there. We've got multinational venues. We've got sort of, different corners of our own federal bureaucracy like DoD. It's quite a lot to keep straight. We at CSET and others, I think, will do our best to help folks keep them straight. But I want to move now from talking about sort of the cast of characters to some of the content of these regulations that we might see emerging or see in debate over the next year. Just a reminder, while I'm at it, the Q&A is open. We've got some great questions coming in so far, and are eagerly sort of compiling those for the Q&A period, which will start pretty soon. But please feel free to drop your questions in there, and we'll get a good conversation going. Matt, let me come to you. So I really appreciate the point you made that China's sort of regulatory apparatus for AI, for those who are not following it, is surprisingly robust, surprisingly sort of well developed and comprehensive, and in many ways ambitious, and in many ways quite thoughtful. There's quite a lot sort of on the books in China already. For folks who are browsing our AGORA tool, which is, the only form of multitasking allowed during this webinar, naturally, you'll see a lot of those documents sort of in there and annotated, and it really sort of gives a sense of the ambition of that enterprise. Do you expect 2025 is going to be more about sort of implementing and refining, what's on the books there already, sort of bringing it into practice, or are there still sort of big shoes you're expecting to drop?
Yeah, I'd put it into kind of three buckets of actions. One would be like new laws and regulations. One would be new standards, which are sometimes technical standards. Sometimes they're really about compliance standards, telling companies how to comply with existing regulations. And the third bucket, I don't know what you'd call it, but basically sort of new AI safety related maneuvers. So on like new laws and regulations, this is where I think we're going to see like the least amount of activity. They passed their generative AI law in mid 2023, and sort of during the debate over that and in the fallout from it, the government on the whole has taken the stance that like, hey, maybe we've gone a little bit too hard on these. Instead of launching a bunch of new regulations, let's try to like make compliance on this one smooth, and let's sort of pump the brakes on new laws and regulations. So for example, they released a draft facial recognition regulation in mid 2023, but 18 months later, that draft has never gone final. And this is in part because they're afraid of stemming sort of AI development, but also because they're afraid of sending sort of bad signals to the economy. They don't want to sort of scare private enterprise in any way. So pumping the brakes on those new laws and regulations. On the standards, I think that's where we're going to see a lot of interesting activity. I think there's a document in AGORA, something like basic security or basic safety standards for generative AI in China, which I think I actually sent to you guys a while back saying, hey, you should translate this. And that's one of the more interesting documents. We've seen a lot since it, where it essentially lays out in great detail how companies can comply with the existing regulations. So you need to run these tests. This is exactly how we expect you to do sort of labeling requirements on synthetically generated content, stuff in that along those lines. And they've rolled out a series of these, but I think we're going to see a lot more, with the goal being like, can we essentially control, or at least keep within bounds the content that is generated by these things while lowering the compliance burden. That's sort of their goal these days, and they're getting pretty technically sophisticated at how they do that. So not much on new regulations, probably a lot in the realm of like standards, compliance documents. And the third would be this AI safety category, where over the last year, there's been really active debates in China on whether or not they should set up an AI safety institute, kind of in the mold of the US, UK, and other countries. AI safety on the whole has sort of been having a moment in China where you have a lot of their sort of top tier scientists and policy advisors who are putting this on the agenda for the CCP and sort of telling them to pay attention to it. It seemed like maybe we were going to get a Chinese AI Safety Institute in the second half of this year. That essentially has sort of been tabled. And right now you have a lot of competing proposals, both outside of government and within the Chinese government, within the CCP bureaucracy, with different places competing to become the home of a future AI Safety Institute. So it's unclear whether they're going to sort of press go on that in the next year. And even if they do press go, like, what does this look like? Does it look like a sort of testing focused sort of US UK-esque safety institute, or is it more of like a research hub on stuff related to AI safety? But that's something I'm going to be watching very closely in the months ahead.
Yeah, no, quite a lot going on over there. Mina, I wanted to ask you, and some of this I've taken from your own work, honestly. We're seeing, as AI technology sort of hits the mainstream, some relatively new governance strategies emerging in regulation. There's been a lot of discussion in the US about, for example, establishing public compute resources as a means to sort of encourage AI activity from, folks other than the mega corporations that can run their own data centers. The establishment of AI safety institutes, like Matt was just mentioning, has been sort of a really big push over this last year. Efforts at joint evaluation of AI systems. What are the big deals in all this sort of these emergent approaches, and what do you expect to look lively over the next year?
Yeah, so I'll kind of frame this in terms of some of the priorities that I gave earlier. So kind of AI, these three pillars like AI safety, kind of watching kind of competitor activity on AI, and also strengthening the domestic AI ecosystem. I do think there's going to be a focus on AI safety next year, but exactly what form that's going to take is unclear. Biden's AI executive order and sort of several deliverables from that EO really establish different governance bodies within the federal government to kind of exchange best practices on AI. So kind of collect information on how different agencies are procuring systems, how they're evaluating vendor claims, and so on. So kind of that area I think is still somewhat of a question, an open question. In terms of preventing competitors from kind of gaining an upper hand in AI, I'd expect a doubling down on export controls. I don't expect those to go away anytime soon. I suspect there will also be research into kind of cybersecurity of AI, so or additional research into that field. So how do we fortify AI systems and prevent kind of adversaries from tampering with them? How can we secure model weights and keep them out of the hands of certain people? I think there will also be, a focus on kind of guarding against IP theft, identifying in kind of critical nodes in the AI supply chain, and also monitoring and kind of disclosing foreign actor activity. So I'd expect compute providers to continue to implement Know Your Customer requirements to kind of track how their customers are using compute and whether they're training foundation models using those compute resources that could potentially be used for, say, malicious cyber activity. Kind of looking more domestically, internally, I think the Department of Justice under the Trump administration is still going to be prosecuting antitrust violations. There's still going to be a desire to ensure that there's competition in the AI industry. I think there's going to be a focus on accelerating adoption of AI, probably particularly for national security uses, and also investing in AI enabling infrastructure. So I'm thinking of kind of continued investments in shared compute resources and streamlining data center permitting and approvals. The Commerce Department is sort of frantically allocating money and awards from the CHIPS and Science Act, I don't really see the Trump administration kind of halting that altogether, or kind of doing a big 180 from that strategy.
Yeah, no, we will. That's been fascinating to watch, the sort of pushing out of these massive awards, clearly anticipating something's going to change in policy, but exactly what and to what extent, I think is very much an open question. We have a ton of really good questions piling up. I want to move very soon to the Q&A. Maybe Daniel, let's leave this phase of the discussion. I have kind of a tactical question for you. And that's, motivated in part by our launch today of the AGORA tool, which is meant to sort of help equip people to understand this landscape and all its many actors and initiatives as it evolves. I mean, we've now reached the point, it's early days in AI governance, but we reached the point where we have hundreds of proposed AI bills and regulations in the US, if not more, let alone internationally, or the private sector, what have you. Tools like Agora might help, but I mean, you study this landscape for a living. How are you personally sort of synthesizing everything that's going on? What are your sort of buckets for organization, or just, purely tactically, how are you handling the stream of information? And what do you see as some of the major gaps in that sense? What are sort of areas where we don't have great visibility, or you're still struggling to pull things together?
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating time, right? So AI policy is 6 years old, 8 years old. The first sort of bills and agency documents are 2016, 2018, and now we have a ton. So we're sort of moving from the agenda setting stage to really adopting legislation. So a few of the areas that I'm looking at right now, and I should say with several of our really talented PhD students at GRAIL, really talented faculty, the undergrads who work in our teams. So one of them is looking at whether the sort of responsible AI, the ethical AI ecosystem, are these goals and ambitions, are they mapping out in action? So we've done some research on that in the past. take something like the DoD's responsible AI promises and toolkit, it's been very sort of vocal in this space. How does this play out in practice? And we have the full text for all of these documents in Agora to enable sort of NLP quantitative or qualitative content analyses. So that's one, is sort of how does ethics play out in policy is an area of interest. I would say also comparative work. So one of the questions in policy, public policy, where I study is of diffusion and policy learning, to use the jargon. Are states copying each other? Are countries copying each other? Are they sort of shallowly imitating the practices of other countries or regions? Or are they figuring out, hey, I'm a local agency, there's another local agency in Illinois or Ohio, and I want to learn from them. So how are people learning? And to this question of comparative analysis, a lot of the important action happens, not just at the federal level with these biggest bills or this international, strategic conflict, but what's happening in your local schools and what your hospitals are using and how welfare services are operating. So how all of this gets translated down into subnational and local policies. We're starting to add these documents into Agora for analysis, and we have people who are starting to look at how is this playing out on the local level. And then I'd say sort of broadly, the big gap that I see is studies of implementation and success. So we now know, hey, we got policies, we're passing them, these are our priorities, these are our values, we want to innovate, we want to outcompete people, we have responsible AI. Okay, well, are these policies working? Are they effective? Are they achieving what we want them to achieve? Do we even have good mechanisms for evaluating them? So I think we want to be moving into the stage where in different sectors, at different scales, we want to be looking for measuring policy success. And that's going to be hard to sort of wrangle because it is such a multi-domain issue, but that's what I'm hoping to sort of get traction on in the next few years.
Yeah, no, I really vibe with that last point on sort of understanding implementation versus just the text. I mean, you start with the text, obviously, but there's been fascinating studies, for example, of how the New York City's local law on sort of disclosure of AI systems in hiring has really fallen short of its ambitious promise. There's only a handful of studies like that. We could use so much more about what actually happens on the ground when these laws go in. Early days, interesting days. I want to move right now to the Q&A. We've got questions piling up. I can tell already we're not going to get to all of them, so I'll apologize now and continually. But I want to start with a question, really for everyone. I mean, it's framed as a question for the U.S., but I think equally applies to China and any other government. So Jeff Schaefer asks, how much do you think actual technical developments in the field of AI, things like the advent of agentic AI, potentially, GPT-5 as a stand-in for like much more capable, a bit larger scale models. Do you expect developments like these are going to force the hand of the government in the U.S. federal government or the Chinese central government, and disrupt current preferences? The current administration, for example, seems inclined to take a lighter touch approach in many ways. Are they going to be able to maintain that in the face of potentially very significant developments in the capability of these tools? Same question, certainly in China, even if the outlook is a little different there. So I'll open that up to the group if anyone feels moved in the first instance.
I could pass out this, and I'm curious if it matches y'all's thinking. I'll speak just to the US. So, will major technical developments, agents, or more powerful AI systems kind of force the hand of legislators or regulators? So I would be a little surprised to see this at the federal level for reasons I've discussed earlier with respect to inertia. You have your one AI week a year for Congress to act on this, and there's a lot of other stuff that US Congress is going to be thinking about and worrying about for the next few years: immigration, economy, healthcare, social and political well-being. If there is something like a major incident, we think, or the advancements are really, really dramatic, that could change. But I would sort of, all things being equal, count against federal legislation jumping into major legislation on AI overall. That said, I think we could very well see this happen at the state level. So Governor Newsom in California said, hey, when they vetoed SB 1047 that was meant to govern frontier AI systems, we're going to take another pass at this next time around. We're going to get some more feedback. We're going to iterate this. So I expect that states that don't want to wait for federal action will be paying attention to things like AI agents and increasingly general purpose systems. And maybe a few states will start to put ideas forward.
Mm.
Yeah, Daniel, I agree with all of your thoughts there. I think if there was to be action at the federal level, it would probably come in the form of some executive action. In Biden's executive order and the National Security Memorandum, there's really been kind of a focus on frontier AI systems and very compute-intensive models, and I'd expect that to continue. But if there was some sort of incident that spurred government to action at the federal level, I'd expect it to take the form of some sort of executive order.
I'll jump in quickly on China. Basically, the thing that would force the hand of the government is something that has a huge impact on the speech and online content environment. I think they feel willing and ready to absorb a lot of things when it comes to economic disruptions and other sort of social impacts. But the thing that is non-negotiable is making sure that essentially that their censorship controls remain in place and they're still able to guide public opinion in the way they need to. Do AI agents do that? Does GPT-5 do that? Not entirely clear. Maybe something related to AI generated video. They might feel like they need to do an update or an add-on to the generative AI regulation. But that's the one thing that really forces their hand from their perspective.
Mm. Yeah, no, that checks out. I'm looking at a question from Jack Shanahan, who's mentioning this book. Some of you may have read, Digital Empires by Anu Bradford. Advancing sort of a paradigm for thinking about AI and geopolitics that I think is probably familiar, whether or not you've read the book. That we have sort of three dominant powers. We have the U.S., we have China, and we have sort of the EU as centers of AI activity and of AI regulatory activity. Do you think this is a useful way to sort of piece the world out when you think about AI governance in particular? And to the extent it is, how do the divisions between these different groups shape multinational efforts or bilateral efforts, et cetera, including in venues like the UN? Do you think those are venues where these sorts of actors can come together, these sort of different perspectives can come together, and what results should we expect, if any?
Maybe I'll just say something briefly on the UN. I'm not a UN expert, but this is something that China is pretty consistent in saying that the UN should be the appropriate venue for international governance of AI. I think they've slightly backed off that in the last year or so. For a long time, that was their continued refrain. People in the US government look at that and they say that's because you don't want anything to actually happen, and nothing will happen at the UN. From China's perspective, the UN feels like the one place where they're guaranteed to not be excluded because they're on the Security Council. They're constantly afraid of being excluded from these other networks, AC networks, summits, et cetera. So I think when we talk about sort of global governance, that's a little bit too broad. And maybe the only thing that might happen at a semi-global scale is something in the realm of sort of diffusion of technology, helping countries in the global south with adoption and stuff like that. I think that is the role that the UN is best suited to. And it gets outside of this kind of three digital empires realm. Those are the drivers of a lot of change, but they're not the main people being impacted. And so if it is something at the UN, I think it's going to be sort of about diffusion, capability enhancement for poorer countries, I should say. And that is something that's sort of China's like drumbeat these days, is we are the country that wants to share AI with the world. The US is the country that wants to exclude people from it. And they're trying to sort of channel that energy through the UN.
Yeah, I'd add that, it's understandable kind of why this kind of frame of reference is useful, kind of viewing the US, China, and EU as kind of the three AI powers, given kind of the strides they've made in terms of AI regulation and being kind of homes to companies that are building really powerful AI models. I'd add, though, that there's a lot of really valuable work being done on AI by other countries and other regions of the world. Singapore has an AI Safety Institute, for example, and they've done really good work on sort of actually kind of piloting AI systems and granting kind of AI accreditations. Matt mentioned kind of the UN and the global majority, I'd agree. I think I've heard sort of kind of China's position on this being framed as a champion of the global majority and the global South, I think it's really important that we hear from the perspectives of other countries and other regions, and I think really kind of the convening of different AI safety institutes kind of allows for that and allows different countries to sort of inject their perspectives into the AI governance debate.
That also sort of very much matches my instincts, and I'll say I've used sort of Bradford's parsing in my own teaching, at least for sort of as governance paradigms, vertical versus horizontal. How strict is this? But I was going to make a very similar point, Mina, about the majority of the world's population is in other countries, the plurality at least. So whether or not the other 50, 60 plus countries that have AI strategies and tools and services are, shaping the most, prominent agendas or the early movers here, they're shaping the experiences of huge portions of people. So I think both of these things can be true. Analytically, the dominant countries are important, but India also articulated itself as the sort of the hub for the global South. Their national strategy is called #AI for all. What's happening in Kenya or Nigeria or Rwanda or United Arab Emirates or Israel or Korea, all quite important. And then to the UN point, yeah, it's again, barring a major sort of incident, I wouldn't anticipate massive global governance. Maybe things like shared compute, shared research agendas, but a global monitoring regime seems less likely. If anything, for very limited cases like weapons, and even that has been a hard sell internationally. So more, as Matt said, targeted initiatives supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, technology transfer, that kind of role.
Matt, I'm gonna try an advanced moderator maneuver and combine a couple different questions on China's regulatory system specifically. We've got good input from Evan D. Petrillo, and I'm going to take a piece of a question by Kimberly Owens. So do with this what you will. But on the one hand, we've got a question: Do strict PRC regulations on AI use only cover generative AI, or do they cover other areas as well, such as computer vision? And how, is this really quite burdensome? How different how heavy is the burden in different areas or otherwise? And then Kimberly Owens asks what I see as a related question about sort of the impact of this burden on China's overall competitiveness in AI, which I think in the US we hear regulation, we assume bad for competitiveness, bad for innovation. But the question here is, wouldn't a higher bar for AI governance in China give China a competitive edge potentially by addressing potential harms from the technology proactively versus the US approach, which seems to be more sort of fragmented, localized, piecemeal, and with the inefficiencies that might imply? So pick up any part of that question you want.
Yeah, I'll try advanced panelist maneuver and combine those as well, which is, I think the through line in all the regulations is content, online content. That is the trunk of all the regulations. And that has implications on both sides. So first, do they cover any other issues? They do touch on other issues. So the regulations so far have covered recommendation algorithms, deepfakes, and generative AI. All of those are about the production of online content, and in recommendation algorithms, the dissemination of online content. So that's the focus. And I think that let's see, I'll first go to the first question. Are there other areas covered? Essentially, other interest groups tack on their issues to these regulation, so recommendation algorithms. There was also a big public outcry about the role of algorithms in scheduling delivery workers, giving them very like unrealistic delivery times that led to accidents and death and stuff like that. And so the people who care about that issue were like, that's kind of like a recommendation algorithm too. And so they sort of tacked that onto the recommendation algorithm regulation. And so that it has impacts beyond pure content. It impacts, like their online food ordering and delivery systems. And it has imposed a significant burden on those companies. They spent a lot of time trying to react to those regulations and the scandals involved. In terms of, does this give them an advantage in terms of setting a high bar? I think at first pass, no, because the high bar they're setting is very China CCP specific. It's about content that the CCP doesn't like. Maybe look a little bit deeper, and I think there is something there, which is that China's essentially built a very expansive regulatory toolkit, a lot of mechanisms, mandatory registration, pre-deployment testing, ways that you deal with data sets and labeling of synthetic content. And that's currently the vast majority of that energy is directing those tools towards content-focused things. But those tools can be repurposed towards other sort of goals. They could be repurposed towards bias goals. They could be repurposed in some ways, maybe towards labor goals. So they've kind of built out this toolkit that could be an advantage in terms of being nimble and having a good regulatory sort of response time. Right now, it's very focused on content, and it's largely imposing a burden or in some ways dissuading companies from entering the market. But if you look a little bit longer term, these are tools that could be reused in other areas.
Yeah. Mina, Daniel, actually, I want to, get your take on the last part of that as well. Is AI regulation, even burdensome AI regulation, pro-innovation, pro-competitiveness in some sense or under some conditions? Or more generally, how do you see the relationship between AI governance and the advancement and the deployment of the technology? Is this a tension? And if so, what are its contours?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So, I think by and large, the Biden administration has framed kind of governance to advance AI safety and trustworthiness as kind of a cornerstone of AI adoption and AI innovation. I think the US AI Safety Institute is a great example of this. It's done really, really fantastic work kind of on advancing measurement science, promulgating best practices for AI risk management, studying kind of AI safety. And there have been kind of some actions by regulators over the past year with kind of AI innovation being a primary objective. So I'm thinking of kind of some investigations and that have been taken by the FTC and the Department of Justice to really sort of investigate kind of investments and partnerships between big tech companies with the goal of preventing anti-competitive practices, but also promoting AI innovation. And another example that comes to mind is the NARE, the National AI Research Resource. There was a pilot of the NARE done in January, and the objective there was to really broaden the opportunities that academic and research communities have to experiment with compute-intensive models. And so in my view, really the prevailing sentiment from the federal level over the past year has been that AI safety and trustworthiness speeds us up. It doesn't slow us down. Now, the incoming administration, I think, is going to look a lot less favorably on AI regulation. But kind of exactly how that will unfold remains to be seen.
To add to that, I think one can make the case there are areas of direct conflict. I wouldn't want to say, look, no regulations cut against innovation, and sometimes you do want to cut against innovation. You want those protections, but I've come to increasingly think of these not as a binary. but as complementary. So well-designed federal regulation can enable effective corporate governance and better innovation. And I think there are really good examples of this, like NAIR, like the AI Safety Institute and Consortium. Thinking about some of the innovations in the space over the last few years, things like red teaming, still sort of new in this space, but becoming mainstream, some of the safety assessments, industry-led standards that sort of set the agenda for what became things like the NIST AI risk management framework. So these are ideas that came from private sector, academia, civil society that have sort of filtered up and moved progress along quite a bit more. If you think about a federal policy, and it says, look, all companies need to, manage risks. They need to make sure to not have bias or whatever the concept may be. You bring this down to a data scientist, and they say, goodness, I don't know how to measure human rights impacts in my generative AI model. What do I do here? So having a law in place doesn't just make stuff happen. And this is part of why we've had companies and developers and academics in conversations with government and standards organizations saying like, look, this is how we think we can do an evaluation. This is how we think we can do measurement or AI safety as a science. So I think that well-designed, these things are not just sort of complementary, but indispensable.
Maybe if I could just add just very quickly 2 cents on this. I think one framing for the innovation regulation trade-off is a lot of it depends on our consumers demanding certain things of the products. If there's no regulation on autonomous vehicles, there's a lot of crashes, consumers are afraid to get in the vehicles and the market doesn't function because of that, or because of the uncertainty, then regulation that sets a standard and that instills trust would increase innovation in the field. It would help the market function. When consumers aren't demanding these things, they're okay working with services that are essentially unregulated, then I think you're in a sort of negative trade-off. So a lot of it depends on what we, the consumers or the markets or the people, are demanding of these products.
No, point well taken. So we are just about at time, and we have a ton of really good questions. I'm just afraid we're not going to get to on talent policy, on energy policy, lots of interesting stuff that we're just going to run out of time for, as we knew we would. So apologies to everyone. I want to encourage folks. I personally am willing to field any questions by email to the extent I have anything useful to say about them. I'm sure all of our panelists would say the same, and their contact information is out there in the cloud. But we are nothing if not timely here at CSET, so I think we're going to wrap up the webinar here. I want to thank our panelists, thank the audience for joining us. We will follow up soon with details of our next CSET webinar. In the meantime, if you want to make sure you're hearing about upcoming events or new analysis, CSET's website is cset.georgetown.edu. And of course, our AGORA tool, which we've been discussing today in today's webinar, that's live today at agora.eto.tech. Please don't hesitate to contact me or our Emerging Technology Observatory team. You can use the contact page on our website and the support options there. Again, that's eto.tech. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Thanks again to everyone for joining, panelists and audience alike, and all the best from DC. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.